The sun rose slowly over the dusty plains, casting a soft golden light across the ranch. But for Thomas, a poor rancher in his mid-30s, mornings brought no comfort. His small ranch, once alive with cattle and activity, now stood on the edge of ruin. A single frail cow grazed lazily in the corner of the pasture, its bones showing through its hide. The rest of the herd was long gone, sold off, one by one, to pay debts, buy feed, and keep the ranch barely alive. Thomas leaned against the old wooden fence, his hands calloused, his shirt worn thin from years of hard work. He wasn't lazy. In fact, he worked from dawn until dusk. But no matter how much effort he put in, the land seemed cursed. The soil had grown dry and stubborn, the rains less frequent, and the money he earned never enough to cover both his survival and the animals' needs. Life had not been kind to him. His parents had left him the ranch when they died, but instead of being an inheritance of prosperity, it felt like a burden chained to his ankle. Neighbors had sold their land and moved to town, but Thomas refused to give up. He told himself, daily, "This is my land. I'll make it work." Yet deep down, he wondered if stubbornness was the only thing keeping him here. Food had become scarce. Most nights he survived on bread, beans, or thin soup stretched with whatever vegetables he could grow. Sometimes he skipped meals altogether to make sure the cow had something to eat. The cow was his last real possession of value, and he treated it almost like family, because in truth, it was all he had left. But the weight of poverty went beyond empty stomachs. It crushed his spirit, making him feel small in a world where men were judged by their success. Other ranchers had thriving lands, herds of cattle, and families to support them. Thomas had none of that. He was unmarried, alone, and whispered about in town. People pitied him, some mocked him, but few offered help. When he walked into the market, he felt the eyes of others on him. He overheard snatches of gossip. "That's the rancher who can't keep his land alive." Or worse, "He'll lose it all soon." Each comment cut deeper than the last. Despite it all, Thomas wasn't heartless. He was kind to his neighbors when he could be, helped mend fences, or lent a hand during branding season. But kindness didn't pay bills, and the debts piled higher each month. One evening, sitting on the porch of his small, weathered home, Thomas stared out across the land. The horizon stretched endlessly, but instead of hope, all he felt was emptiness. His body ached, his heart heavy with worry. He asked himself questions no man wanted to face. How much longer can I hold on? Should I sell the last cow? Should I abandon the ranch? What will become of me? That night, as the stars lit up the sky, he lay awake in his small bed, unable to sleep. He thought about marriage, too. Not out of romance. He had long given up on that, but out of necessity. Life alone was harder than he admitted. Sometimes he wished for someone beside him, someone to share the burden even if love never blossomed. But who would marry a man like him? Poor, ragged, with nothing to offer except a dying ranch and a cow. The next morning, Thomas walked into town to see if anyone would buy eggs or a small bag of corn he had harvested. He barely earned enough to buy salt and a piece of cloth to patch his clothes. On the way back, he ran into Mr. Wallace, a wealthy but stern neighbor. Wallace eyed him up and down, a smirk on his face. "You're still hanging on, Thomas?" Wallace asked, half in pity, half in mockery. Thomas forced a weak smile. "Trying my best," Wallace chuckled. "Trying doesn't feed the land. Maybe you should think about making other arrangements." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" Wallace paused, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I've got a deal for you. Something that might solve your problems." Thomas raised an eyebrow, wary but curious. Wallace continued, "My daughter, she's not married. No man's been willing to take her hand. But she's strong, she can work, and she needs a husband. I'll give you a healthy cow if you marry her. What do you say? The words hit Thomas like a hammer. Marry a stranger. For a cow? It sounded absurd. Yet in that moment, Thomas thought of his starving ranch, his debts, his loneliness, his heart, clenched, torn between pride and desperation. He walked away from Wallace that day with the offer echoing in his head. He didn't know what he would choose yet, but the weight of poverty pressed harder than ever, and somewhere deep inside, he felt that his life was about to change in ways he could never imagine. The offer from Mr. Wallace clung to Thomas like dust he couldn't shake off. As he trudged back to his ranch that evening, every step felt heavier than the last. Marry his daughter? For a cow? The thought was both absurd and humiliating, yet hauntingly tempting. His mind wrestled with itself, pulling him between pride and desperation. By the time Thomas reached his creaky front porch, the sun had already begun to set, painting the sky in shades of crimson. He sat in his wooden chair, staring at the lone cow grazing in the pasture, its ribs pressed against its hide, its movements sluggish. He knew it wouldn't last the winter without help. That night, Thomas couldn't eat. He sat at his small wooden table, staring at the single bowl of beans before him, but every bite tasted like ash. The words of Mr. Wallace echoed in his mind. She needs a husband. I'll give you a cow. Thomas tried to reason with himself. It's just one cow. Maybe I could find another way. Maybe I could borrow money from town or sell a bit more land. But the truth was undeniable. He had already borrowed more than he could repay, and selling land would mean selling away his heritage. He thought about Wallace's daughter. He had seen her only a handful of times in passing. A large woman, quiet, always in the shadow of her father. Town gossip was cruel. People whispered about her size, called her unmarriageable, and laughed when she walked by. Thomas never joined in, but he never defended her either. She was simply a distant figure, someone else's story. Now suddenly she was being offered to him like a bargain struck over cattle. The rancher felt shame heat his face. Marriage, in his eyes, was supposed to be sacred, two people choosing each other. But this was no choice. Not really. It was survival. For 2 days, Thomas avoided the decision. He worked from dawn till dusk, fixing fences, feeding his cow, patching holes in the barn. But no matter how busy he kept his hands, his mind always circled back. His cow needed a companion, his debts were climbing, and winter was creeping closer. On the 3rd morning, hunger finally broke his resistance. His pantry was nearly bare. Just a sack of flour and a handful of beans remained. He stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the emptiness. His stomach growled, but more than that, his heart ached with the realization. He couldn't keep going like this. That afternoon, Thomas walked the dusty road back to Mr. Wallace's farm. The ranch stood tall, its barns freshly painted, its fields brimming with healthy cattle. It was everything his ranch used to be, everything it wasn't anymore. Mr. Wallace met him at the gate, as though he had been expecting him. A sly smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "So, Thomas," Wallace said, folding his arms, "have you thought about my offer?" Thomas's throat tightened. He wanted to refuse, to hold on to his pride. But when he opened his mouth, the truth spilled out in a low, almost defeated tone. "I'll do it." Wallace's smile widened, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Good man. You won't regret it." But Thomas already regretted it. His chest felt hollow, his pride shattered. Later that evening, he was invited inside for dinner with Wallace's family. The table was filled with roasted meat, fresh bread, and vegetables, luxuries Thomas hadn't tasted in months. He sat stiffly, uneasy, until she entered the room. Wallace's daughter. Her name was Mary. She was larger than Thomas remembered, her frame filling the doorway. Her cheeks flushed as she realized why Thomas was there. She didn't speak at first, just lowered her eyes and took her place at the table. The silence between them was heavy, awkward, and filled with unspoken truths. Wallace, ever the businessman, wasted no time. "The wedding will be this weekend," he declared. "The sooner it's done, the better." Mary's eyes flicked up at Thomas then, studying him quietly. There was no hatred in her gaze, no bitterness, just sadness and something else, resignation. She knew just as Thomas did that this wasn't a marriage born of love. It was a transaction, a deal struck over cattle. After dinner, as Thomas prepared to leave, Mary surprised him. She stepped onto the porch beside him, her voice soft but steady. "You don't want this, do you?" Thomas froze. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Honesty would wound her, but lies felt crueler. Finally, he managed a strained whisper. "I don't know what I want anymore." Mary nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Neither do I." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then she said something that lingered in Thomas's mind long after he walked home under the starlit sky. "Sometimes life doesn't give us choices, only chances. Maybe this is one." Thomas didn't know what to make of it. All he knew was that in less than a week he would stand beside Mary at the altar, bound not by love, but by desperation and the promise of a cow. And, though his heart felt heavy, a small part of him wondered, could this deal really change everything? The morning of the wedding came sooner than Thomas expected. The week passed in a blur, neighbors whispering, preparations buzzing, and Wallace moving things along with the efficiency of a man who brokered deals daily. But for Thomas, each hour felt like a countdown toward surrender. He stood in his small room before dawn, pulling on his best shirt, the one he wore only for Sunday church. It was patched at the elbows, faded from years of sun, but it was the only decent garment he owned. He glanced at himself in the mirror, a tired face, roughened by work and weather. His eyes carried the look of a man cornered, forced into something. He could neither fight nor escape. He sighed and muttered, "Well, Thomas, today you trade your freedom for a cow." The ride to Wallace's farm was long and silent. His lone cow watched him leave, swishing its tail lazily, unaware of the role it played in this arrangement. When he arrived, the yard was filled with people, neighbors, church members, and curious townsfolk. Word of the unusual bargain had spread quickly, and many had come not out of kindness, but out of curiosity. Whispers traveled through the crowd like wildfire. "He's marrying her for a cow." Can you believe it? Poor man. Poor woman. Thomas kept his head down, forcing himself not to react. Shame burned in his chest, but pride held his shoulders straight. He would endure this. He had no other choice. Inside the modest church, Mary stood near the altar, dressed in a simple white gown. It wasn't fancy or new, likely sewn by her own hands, but it carried a quiet dignity. Her hair was tied neatly, her face calm. Yet Thomas noticed the tremor in her hands as she clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers. For the first time, he truly looked at her, not as Wallace's daughter, not as a stranger in a bargain, but as a woman about to enter a marriage as reluctantly as he was. Her eyes, when they briefly met his, held a mixture of sadness and bravery. It struck him unexpectedly. She was just as trapped as he was. The ceremony began. The pastor's voice droned on, speaking words of unity and love that felt hollow in Thomas's ears. He barely heard them, his thoughts swirling. When the time came for vows, his throat tightened. He spoke the words softly, almost mechanically. "I do." Mary's voice followed, steady and surprisingly firm. "I do." The room filled with murmurs. Some smiled politely, others shook their heads. To them, this was little more than a spectacle. But for Thomas and Mary, it was the beginning of something neither fully understood. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas felt no joy, no spark of love, only the weight of responsibility settling heavier on his shoulders. He stole a glance at Mary. Her face was unreadable, but her posture straightened as though she too had accepted the burden of this bond. Outside the church, Wallace wasted no time. He led Thomas to the barn, where a strong, healthy cow stood, tethered. As promised, Wallace said, smugness in his voice. May she bring you better fortune than the last one. Thomas nodded stiffly, gripping the rope. The cow was beautiful, well-fed, sturdy, a lifeline for his struggling ranch. Yet as he looked at it, the truth cut through him. His marriage had been sealed for this animal, a cow in exchange for a wife. He wasn't sure if he should laugh bitterly or weep. That evening, after the guests dispersed and the whispers died down, Thomas and Mary rode back to his ranch together in silence. The new cow followed on a lead, plodding along behind them. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land as they arrived at the small, weathered home that was now Mary's too. Thomas dismounted and helped her down. For a moment, they stood side by side, gazing at the ranch. It wasn't much to look at, just a small house, a struggling pasture, and a barn that needed repair. Compared to her father's thriving estate, it was humble, even pitiful. "I'm sorry it isn't more," Thomas said quietly, almost ashamed. Mary glanced at him, her expression softening. "It's enough. It's home." Her words surprised him. Not because they were tender, he hadn't expected tenderness, but because they carried no sarcasm, no bitterness, just acceptance. That night, as they sat across from each other at the wooden table eating a thin stew Thomas had prepared, the air was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Every creak of the house, every scrape of a spoon echoed in the silence between them. Finally, Mary broke it. "We don't have to pretend," she said softly. "I know why you married me, and I know why my father pushed it. Neither of us chose this, but maybe we can make it work." Thomas looked at her, unsure how to respond. He had braced himself for resentment, for anger, even for tears. But instead, she offered him something unexpected. A chance. He gave a slow nod. "Maybe." And as they cleared the table in silence, Thomas felt a strange stirring in his chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something else. A fragile seed of possibility, buried beneath the soil of hardship. Little did he know that seed would begin to grow on this very night, the night that marked the beginning of their unlikely marriage. The second night of their marriage arrived with a heavy stillness in the air. The day had been long. Thomas worked in the fields, mending fences and hauling water, while Mary busied herself inside, cleaning and cooking with quiet diligence. They spoke little, their conversations limited to practical matters. Where the flour was stored, how much wood was left for the stove, which tools needed repair. Yet beneath the silence, something stirred. The awareness that they were now husband and wife, not just in name, but in the eyes of the community, the law, and God. And though neither had spoken of it, the unspoken expectation hung between them like a shadow. That evening, after dinner, Thomas lingered outside, sitting on the porch with a pipe he hadn't lit in months. The night air was cool, the stars scattered like diamonds across the dark sky. He stared out at the fields, trying to calm the unease in his chest. He wasn't ready. He wasn't sure he ever would be. Inside, Mary prepared for bed, folding her dress neatly over the chair and braiding her hair. Her heart pounded, though her face betrayed no emotion. She knew what others expected of her as a wife, but she also knew Thomas's hesitation, his discomfort. She had seen it in his eyes from the first day. He hadn't chosen her. He had chosen survival. When Thomas finally entered the house, the lantern light flickered softly against the walls. He avoided Mary's gaze, muttering, "I'll take the chair again tonight." But as he reached for the rocker, he heard a soft, deliberate sound behind him. Click! He turned sharply. Mary had risen from the bed and locked the door. The key slid into her palm, hidden in the folds of her nightgown. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest. "Why'd you do that?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. Mary met his gaze steadily, her eyes glinting with quiet determination. "Because, Thomas, you keep running. You avoid me, avoid this marriage, avoid even looking at me. But you can't keep running forever. Tonight we face it." He swallowed hard, his palms sweating. "Face what? I told you, I didn't marry you by choice. I only did this for the cow, that's the truth." Her expression didn't falter. "I know, and I didn't marry you by choice either. My father decided my worth was measured in cattle. Do you think I wanted this? To be handed off like a trade? No, Thomas. I wanted a man who'd see me for more than my size, more than his own desperation. But here we are. And since we didn't get to choose this life, maybe we can at least choose how we live it." Her words cut through him. For the first time, he realized how much strength it must have taken for her to lock that door. Not to trap him, but to force a reckoning neither of them had dared face. Thomas sank onto the edge of the chair, his hands gripping the wood tightly. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to be a husband when I don't even feel like a man anymore. I've lost everything. My land is failing, my pride is gone. Marrying you felt like the final proof of my failure." Mary's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "And do you think I don't feel the same? Every whisper in town, every laugh behind my back, I've carried that shame my whole life. To them, I am nothing but the 400-pound woman no man wanted. But I am more than that, Thomas. And so are you." The room was silent except for the faint whistle of the wind outside. Thomas finally looked at her, not as a burden, not as a stranger, but as a person who bore her own wounds, her strength. In locking that door wasn't about power. It was about refusing to live in silence any longer. Slowly, Mary stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. She placed the key on the table between them. "The door is locked, yes, but the choice is yours. If you want to leave, you can take the key. If you stay, then maybe we can start something real." Thomas stared at the key, his mind reeling. For so long he had felt powerless, trapped by circumstance. But here, now, Mary was offering him something he hadn't expected. Choice. His hand hovered over the key, then withdrew. He didn't take it. Instead, he let out a shaky breath and whispered, "I'll stay." Mary gave a small nod, her expression unreadable, yet her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a beginning. That night, they didn't become lovers. Nor did they pretend at romance. They simply shared the same room, the same silence, the same fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this marriage could become more than a bargain sealed for a cow. By late summer, the ranch no longer looked like the weary stretch of land it once was. Where weeds had run wild, there were now neat rows of corn and beans, their leaves swaying in the warm breeze. The barn, once sagging at the sides, stood straighter, after weeks of repair. The fences were sturdy, the cattle healthier. Life pulsed in every corner, and Thomas couldn't ignore the truth. The ranch was thriving, and so was he. And Mary was at the center of it all. Everywhere Thomas looked, he saw her touch. She had a way of noticing what needed care before he did. A chicken coop that needed patching, a goat limping on its leg, a roof shingle loose before the next storm. She worked with patience, never demanding recognition, yet her presence had become the lifeblood of the ranch. Thomas often caught himself watching her, not with the reluctant glances of the early days, but with a quiet admiration that grew stronger each time. He noticed how her face softened when she sang to the animals, how her laughter filled the silence of the evenings, how her eyes shone when she saw something she had tended bloom into life. One afternoon, as they harvested the garden, Thomas found himself staring too long as Mary wiped her brow, the sunlight glinting off her hair. She looked up, caught his gaze, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "What is it?" she asked, tilting her head. Thomas hesitated. Words had never come easy for him, but in that moment, he felt compelled to speak. "I was just thinking how different things are now, how different I am now." Mary's lips curved into a gentle smile. "Different isn't always bad." Her words lingered in his mind long after. That night, as they sat at the table eating stew she had made, Thomas felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the food. It was something deeper, an affection he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He remembered how, when the marriage began, he had thought only of the cow, the land, his pride. But now, when he thought of his future, Mary was there at the center. Not as a burden, not as part of a bargain, but as the reason the future even seemed possible. Still, Thomas was cautious. He carried his feelings quietly, unsure if Mary felt the same. He didn't want to frighten her or make her think he pitied her. But fate has a way of revealing what the heart tries to hide. It happened on a stormy night. Rain battered the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks of the house. Thomas was outside securing the barn doors when a sudden flash of lightning struck nearby, startling the cattle. He rushed inside, soaked to the bone, to find Mary standing in the doorway, her hands clenched at her chest. "You scared me half to death," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought something happened to you." Thomas blinked at her, surprised by the raw fear in her tone. "I'm fine," he said softly. "You don't have to worry." Her eyes glistened, and in a whisper that seemed to slip out before she could stop it, she said, "But I do worry. About you." The words pierced through him like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. He stepped closer, dripping water onto the floor, and for the first time, he dared to let his hand rest gently on her shoulder. "And I worry about you," he admitted, "more than I thought I ever would." For a long moment they stood in silence, the storm raging outside while something gentler stirred between them. It was as though the walls they had both carried, his pride, her guardedness, were finally crumbling. After that night, everything shifted. Their conversations grew deeper, their silences more comfortable, their laughter easier. They shared burdens and joys as though they were no longer two people bound by necessity, but partners bound by choice. Even the townsfolk began to notice. When Thomas came to market with Mary at his side, he no longer shrank from the whispers. He walked proudly, letting the world see that he valued her. And though the gossip didn't stop, some began to soften, seeing the strength of the couple who had built something beautiful out of hardship. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, Thomas turned to Mary and said, "Do you ever think about how this all started?" She gave a small laugh. "Every day." "I thought I was just getting a cow," he said, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "But I was wrong. I was given something far greater." Mary's eyes softened, and for the first time, she reached for his hand without hesitation. Their fingers intertwined, fitting as naturally as if they had always belonged together. And in that quiet moment, Thomas understood that his life had truly transformed. The ranch had been saved, yes, but more importantly, his heart had been saved, too. What began as a forced arrangement had blossomed into something rare, something precious. Love. the very thing he had never expected to find. The first frost of autumn painted the fields silver, and the ranch stood as a quiet testament to resilience. Cattle grazed contentedly, barns were full, and the once crumbling fences now stretched proudly across the land. But the true transformation wasn't in the wood or soil, it was in the two hearts that had grown together through trials, storms, and unexpected grace. Thomas leaned against the porch railing one crisp morning, watching Mary hang laundry in the yard. The sheets billowed like sails in the breeze, and she hummed softly, her face glowing with peace. He thought of the man he had been months ago, bitter, prideful, broken. A man who saw Mary only as a means to an end, and he marveled at how blind he had been. Mary noticed his gaze and raised an eyebrow with a playful smirk. "You're staring again." "Can you blame me?" Thomas replied, his voice warm. She blushed lightly, shaking her head. "You used to look at me so differently." "I was a fool back then," Thomas admitted. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the frosted grass. "I thought I was making a sacrifice. But it turns out marrying you was the best thing I ever did." Mary's eyes softened, and for a moment, the years of loneliness she had carried seemed to melt away. "You mean that?" she asked gently. "With all my heart," Thomas said, his voice steady. "I don't see the woman I thought I was forced to marry. I see the woman who saved me, saved this ranch, saved my spirit. I see my partner, my friend, my wife." Mary's breath caught, and tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of belonging. She had lived her whole life believing she was unwanted, too much for others to carry, destined to remain on the outside of joy. Yet here stood a man who saw her not as a burden, but as his blessing. The wind tugged at her hair as Thomas reached for her hand, their fingers intertwined, and Mary squeezed his with a strength that spoke of all the silent battles she had fought to be loved. "I never thought someone could see me the way you do," she whispered. Thomas pulled her gently into his arms. "I didn't either, but love has a way of sneaking up when you least expect it. Sometimes it walks through the door in the most unexpected form and changes your whole world." They stood there, holding each other against the backdrop of golden fields, the ranch alive around them. The silence between them was no longer awkward or uncertain. It was full, rich, a silence that needed no words. As the days grew colder, their bond only deepened. Winter came, and with it, long evenings by the fire. They shared stories, dreams, and plans for the future. Mary often teased Thomas about how he had once thought her locked door was a threat, when in truth it had been the first step toward unlocking both their hearts. By spring, the ranch wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. Neighbors who had once mocked or whispered now came seeking advice. They saw in Thomas and Mary a strength that couldn't be measured by appearances or weight or wealth, but by the love that bound them. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas surprised Mary. He had fixed up the old swing that hung from the oak tree near the house. When she stepped outside, he guided her to it and gently pushed her as the sun dipped low on the horizon. "You know," he said with a smile, "that cow your father gave me was worth a lot, but compared to you, Mary, it was nothing." She laughed through happy tears, swaying gently in the swing. "You finally admit it?" "I do," Thomas said firmly, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. "I don't care what anyone thinks anymore. You're my wife, my partner, my love, and I wouldn't trade you for all the cows in the world." Mary's laughter turned into quiet sobs of joy as she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. In that moment, the last shadow of doubt in her heart vanished. She was wanted. She was cherished. She was home. the stars began to appear one by one in the twilight sky, and there, beneath the vast expanse of heaven, two souls who had once been strangers bound by a bargain now stood as partners bound by love. The ranch, the cow, the gossip of the town, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the life they had built, the trust they had nurtured, and the love that had bloomed where neither of them had ever expected it. And as Thomas held Mary close, he whispered the truth he now knew deep in his bones. Sometimes, love doesn't come the way you imagine, but when it does, it's stronger, truer, and more beautiful than you ever dreamed. The second night of their marriage arrived with a heavy stillness in the air. The day had been long. Thomas worked in the fields, mending fences and hauling water, while Mary busied herself inside, cleaning and cooking with quiet diligence. They spoke little, their conversations limited to practical matters, where the flour was stored, how much wood was left for the stove, which tools needed repair. Yet beneath the silence, something stirred. The awareness that they were now husband and wife, not just in name, but in the eyes of the community, the law, and God. And though neither had spoken of it, the unspoken expectation hung between them like a shadow. That evening, after dinner, Thomas lingered outside, sitting on the porch with a pipe he hadn't lit in months. The night air was cool, the stars scattered like diamonds across the dark sky. He stared out at the fields, trying to calm the unease in his chest. He wasn't ready. He wasn't sure he ever would be. Inside, Mary prepared for bed, folding her dress neatly over the chair and braiding her hair. Her heart pounded, though her face betrayed no emotion. She knew what others expected of her as a wife, but she also knew Thomas's hesitation, his discomfort. She had seen it in his eyes from the first day. He hadn't chosen her. He had chosen survival. When Thomas finally entered the house, the lantern light flickered softly against the walls. He avoided Mary's gaze, muttering, "I'll take the chair again tonight." But as he reached for the rocker, he heard a soft, deliberate sound behind him. Click. He turned sharply. Mary had risen from the bed and locked the door. The key slid into her palm, hidden in the folds of her nightgown. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest. "Why'd you do that?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. Mary met his gaze steadily, her eyes glinting with quiet determination. "Because, Thomas, you keep running. You avoid me. Avoid this marriage. Avoid even looking at me. But you can't keep running forever. Tonight, we face it." He swallowed hard, his palms sweating. "Face what? I told you. I didn't marry you by choice. I only did this for the cow. That's the truth." Her expression didn't falter. "I know. And I didn't marry you by choice either. My father decided my worth was measured in cattle. Do you think I wanted this? To be handed off like a trade? No, Thomas. I wanted a man who'd see me for more than my size, more than his own desperation. But here we are. And since we didn't get to choose this life, maybe we can at least choose how we live it." Her words cut through him. For the first time, he realized how much strength it must have taken for her to lock that door. Not to trap him, but to force a reckoning neither of them had dared face. Thomas sank onto the edge of the chair, his hands gripping the wood tightly. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to be a husband when I don't even feel like a man anymore. I've lost everything. My land is failing, my pride is gone. Marrying you felt like the final proof of my failure." Mary's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "And do you think I don't feel the same? Every whisper in town, every laugh behind my back, I've carried that shame my whole life. To them, I am nothing but the 400-pound woman no man wanted. But I am more than that, Thomas. And so are you." The room was silent except for the faint whistle of the wind outside. Thomas finally looked at her, not as a burden, not as a stranger, but as a person who bore her own wounds. Her strength in locking that door wasn't about power. It was about refusing to live in silence any longer. Slowly, Mary stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. She placed the key on the table between them. The door is locked, yes, but the choice is yours. If you want to leave, you can take the key. If you stay, then maybe we can start something real. Thomas stared at the key, his mind reeling. For so long, he had felt powerless, trapped by circumstance. But here, now, Mary was offering him something he hadn't expected. Choice. His hand hovered over the key, then withdrew. He didn't take it. Instead, he let out a shaky breath and whispered, "I'll stay." Mary gave a small nod, her expression unreadable, yet her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a beginning. That night, they didn't become lovers. Nor did they pretend at romance. They simply shared the same room, the same silence, the same fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this marriage could become more than a bargain sealed for a cow. And as Thomas drifted into uneasy sleep, he realized the locked door hadn't trapped him at all. It had opened something inside him he thought was lost, the possibility of trust. The morning after the locked door was quieter than usual. Thomas rose before dawn, as he always did, and busied himself with chores, feeding the cows, mending a loose board on the fence, drawing water from the well. His hands worked automatically, but his thoughts drifted back to the night before. He remembered the soft click of the lock, Mary's steady eyes, and the key lying untouched on the table. It unsettled him, not because she had trapped him, but because she hadn't. She had given him a choice, and he had chosen to stay. When he returned to the house, the smell of warm bread filled the air. Mary was already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back neatly. She moved with quiet efficiency, pulling loaves from the oven, stirring a pot on the stove. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching her. For a moment, he was struck by the simple domestic scene, the kind he hadn't seen since his mother was alive. A home that felt alive, not empty. Mary noticed him and gave a small nod. "Breakfast is ready." They sat at the table, eating in silence. The bread was fresh, soft, better than anything Thomas had tasted in months. Finally, he cleared his throat. "About last night." Mary's hands paused over her bowl, then rested in her lap. Her eyes met his steadily. "I know what you're going to say. That you don't want this, that you didn't choose me. You don't have to explain, I already know." Thomas frowned. "Then why did you lock the door?" Mary took a deep breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the fabric of her skirt. "Because I was tired of living in silence, tired of letting everyone else decide what I am worth. My father decided it. The town decided it. Even you decided it when you agreed to marry me for a cow." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand gently, stopping him. "Let me finish," she said softly. The room grew still. Mary's voice, though calm, carried the weight of years of pain. "Do you know what it's like to be laughed at every time you walk through town, to see children point and whisper, to be treated like a burden before you've even spoken a word? That has been my life. People see my size, and that's all they see. Not my hands that can work as hard as any man's. Not my mind that can read and count and plan. Not my heart that longs to be seen for who I am. Just my body, just the weight of me." Thomas lowered his gaze, shame creeping into his chest. He had never mocked her, but he realized he had been guilty in another way, by never looking past what others whispered. Mary's voice softened, though her eyes glistened. "I didn't lock that door to trap you. I locked it so we could stop pretending, so you could finally hear me. I don't want to live a life where I am just a bargain, a cow's worth of a woman. If this marriage is to mean anything at all, Thomas, I need to be more than that to you. Even if you can't love me now, at least see me. Respect me." The words struck him harder than any blow. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For so long, he had thought of himself as the only victim in this arrangement, the poor rancher forced into a loveless marriage. But now, listening to Mary, he saw the truth. She had been forced too, and while he lost pride, she had lost her dignity in the eyes of the whole town. Thomas finally spoke, his voice low. "I never thought about it like that. I was so wrapped up in my own troubles, I didn't see yours. I'm sorry, Mary." Her eyes softened, but she didn't smile. "Sorry isn't enough, Thomas. Not if we're going to make this work. Actions will matter more than words." He nodded slowly, the weight of her revelation sinking deep. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't begging for love. She was demanding respect, a partnership, a chance to prove herself, just as he longed for a chance to reclaim his pride. For the rest of the day, Thomas worked alongside Mary. She surprised him, stronger than he expected, sharper with her words, quick to learn the rhythms of the ranch. She mended torn sacks, gathered eggs, even guided the new cow into the pasture with calm authority. By evening, Thomas realized that, for the first time in months, the ranch felt alive again. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mary finally broke the silence. "I know this isn't what you wanted, Thomas, and I can't. Promise it will be easy. But maybe, just maybe, we can build something better than what was forced on us." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, not at her sighs, not at the whispers that followed her, but at the woman beside him. And, for the first time, he saw not a burden, not a stranger, but a partner. Her revelation had changed everything. The next few days slipped by in an unfamiliar rhythm. The ranch, once silent and heavy with neglect, began to hum with life. Thomas noticed it in the smallest of details, the smell of fresh bread in the mornings, the sound of Mary's humming as she worked, the neatness of the kitchen that had once been scattered with dust and cobwebs. Yet it wasn't just the chores she did, or the order she brought to his home. What unsettled Thomas most was how her presence forced him to think about himself, about her, about the life they had been thrust into together. One evening after supper, Thomas sat on the porch alone. The land stretched wide before him, bathed in the golden afterglow of sunset. His hands rested on his knees, calloused and scarred from years of labor. He had always believed those scars were marks of sacrifice, proof that he had endured hardship alone. But now he wondered, was it strength or simply pride that had kept him so isolated? He thought back to Mary's words from that morning a few days ago. "I don't want to be worth a cow. I need to be more than that to you." Those words lingered in his mind like a branding iron on his soul. He realized he had been clinging to the idea of himself as the victim, the poor rancher cheated by fate, forced to marry a woman he never desired. But was that really the truth? Or had he been too proud to admit that Mary, too, bore her own suffering? He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Pride. It had been his armor since the day his parents died. He had built his ranch with his bare hands, turned away charity, refused neighbors' pity. To accept help felt like weakness, and weakness was something Thomas believed he couldn't afford. But Mary wasn't charity. She wasn't a handout or a burden. The way she mended torn sacks without complaint, how she rose at dawn to milk the cow and gather eggs, how she endured the whispers of townsfolk without letting them break her spirit. She was stronger than he had ever given her credit for, and perhaps stronger than him. That thought gnawed at him, unsettled him. Could he admit that a woman, one whom the town mocked, one he had married reluctantly, might actually be the key to his survival? His pride resisted, but his heart whispered otherwise. The next day, Thomas found himself watching her more closely, not in judgment, but in curiosity. He saw how she coaxed the stubborn cow into the pen with a firm but gentle voice, how she hauled buckets of water without hesitation, even when the handle cut into her palms, how she spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight, as if she had thought long before speaking. That evening, he tried something new. As they ate supper, he said, "The bread you baked, it's better than my mother's." Mary glanced up, startled, as if she wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. For a moment, her lips pressed together, and then, slowly, she allowed herself a small smile. "That's kind of you to say." It was a small exchange, almost trivial, but for Thomas it felt like a door cracking open. Complimenting her hadn't cost him anything, and yet it had given something: light to her eyes, warmth to the space between them. Later that night, Thomas lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling above him. His mind was restless. He thought about the years he had spent working himself, to the bone, all to hold on to a pride that had kept him lonely. What had that pride truly given him? An empty house, a failing ranch, nights of hunger, days of bitterness. Now, for the first time, he considered another possibility. Perhaps pride wasn't strength. Perhaps true strength was in allowing someone else to stand beside you. The next morning, Thomas rose early. He found Mary in the barn, tending to the cow. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, taking the bucket from her hands. "I'll carry this," he said. Mary raised an eyebrow. "You think I can't?" Thomas shook his head. "I know you can, but maybe we can do it together." For the first time since their marriage, Mary laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a genuine, hearty laugh that filled the barn. It startled Thomas, but it also stirred something deep within him. That day, as the sun climbed high, Thomas felt a change take root in his heart. His reflection was no longer that of a man beaten down by life, but of someone beginning to learn what partnership truly meant. And though he didn't dare speak it yet, he knew one thing for certain. Mary was no longer just the woman he had married for a cow. She was becoming something far more. The shift between Thomas and Mary was subtle at first, like the first shoots of spring breaking through hard soil. Neither of them announced it, and there were no grand confessions. But in the rhythm of their days, a quiet harmony began to form. Thomas noticed it one morning when he stepped outside to mend a broken fence. Mary was already there, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand. She didn't wait for him to ask for help. She simply took her place, beside him, holding the wood steady while he drove the nails. When the final board was set, they stood back, both breathing hard from the work, and shared a look that spoke louder than words. "We did this together." It was a look Thomas hadn't shared with anyone in years. From that day, everything seemed to take on new meaning. The chores that once felt endless now felt lighter with Mary's presence. The garden flourished under her care, neat rows of vegetables sprouting where weeds had once choked the soil. She had a knack for coaxing life out of barren ground, and Thomas found himself proud, truly proud, of her work. One evening, as they gathered carrots and onions from the garden, Thomas said, "This place looks better than it ever has. That's because of you." Mary's cheeks flushed. "It's because of us." The word lingered in the air, us. It startled Thomas how much comfort he found in that small word. He realized then that his home no longer felt empty. Her laughter, her footsteps, the hum of her voice, they had filled the silence that had once haunted him, but it wasn't just the ranch that was changing, it was Thomas himself. He had begun to listen, to truly listen, to Mary. When she spoke of the cruelty she endured from townsfolk, he didn't brush it aside. He asked questions. He wanted to know her, beyond the weight others mocked her for, beyond the label of a bargain bride. One night, as they sat by the fire, she told him something she had never shared with anyone. "When I was a girl," Mary began, staring into the flames, "I used to think I'd never belong anywhere. People made jokes before I even understood what they meant. My father, he never defended me. He just said I should accept it. So I did. I thought if I just worked hard, maybe I could earn respect. But no matter how much I gave, I was still the girl people laughed at." Her voice cracked, and Thomas's chest tightened. He had never thought of her life before their marriage. He had only seen her as she was on the day they wed, quiet, unreadable. But now he realized she had carried years of silent hurt, the same way he had carried his pride. Without thinking, Thomas reached out and placed his hand over hers. "They were wrong, Mary," he said, his voice low but firm. "They don't see what I see." Mary's eyes glistened, but she gave a small nod, as if the weight she carried had lessened just a little. That night, Thomas lay awake long after Mary had fallen asleep. The feel of her hand lingered on his skin. Something within him had shifted, again. He wasn't just grateful for her work or her presence. He was beginning to care in a way he hadn't allowed himself to in years. The days rolled into weeks, and with each passing one, their bond deepened. They shared stories while working, in the fields, laughed over small mishaps, and sometimes simply enjoyed the quiet together. Thomas found himself looking forward to her company more than anything else. The townsfolk, of course, still whispered when they saw them, but Thomas no longer cared. One afternoon, at the general store, a man made a crude joke about Mary under his breath. Thomas turned, fixed him with a hard glare, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "That woman has done more for me and my ranch in a few weeks than you'll ever do in your life. Show some respect." The store went silent. Mary, standing beside him, lowered her gaze, but a faint smile tugged at her lips. For once, she wasn't invisible. She was defended, valued. That night, as they walked back home with supplies in hand, Mary whispered, "Thank you." Thomas shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. I should have said it long ago." The road back to the ranch stretched wide under the setting sun. For the first time in years, Thomas felt he wasn't walking it alone. He had someone beside him, not out of necessity, not out of transaction, but out of something deeper that was just beginning to bloom. And in the stillness of that evening, Thomas realized that his life, once bound by pride and loneliness, was finally moving toward something new, a beginning he never thought possible.